Well, to all of you, welcome on behalf of all the folks who attend here regularly at Trinity Road Chapel. My name is Doug McMasters. I'm the pastor here, and it is a real pleasure for us to welcome you. I hope you were able to partake of some of our food and our hospitality and to give you a warm welcome. It looks like there's still some available. We'll be taking a break right about in the middle of the debate, so no rushing back there. Be kind to everybody if you go back, and ladies first. But just to give you an idea of what's happening this evening, this is the second in a series of 3 debates that are happening in London. One was at the East London Mosque on Monday. This one is the second one tonight here at Trinity Road Chapel. And then there's a double-header debate, 2 debates in one evening at Twyneham Baptist Church, and that's in Fulham. So details are posted up next to the doors on the way out if you want to find out more about the debate on Monday night, some information there. The debates are occurring between James White, who's the director of Alpha and Omega Ministries, and representatives from the Muslim Debate Initiative, and Abdullah Andalusi, I think is the director of that, are you not? Yes?
No, he is.
Oh, Sami is. Okay, all right. So this is the 4th debate, so 4 years running that we've had debates here at Trinity Road Chapel and also at other venues with James White and the Muslim Debate Initiative. It's a real joy for us to be able to come together and to focus our attention upon a very important subject. It will be concerning the Quranic denial of the crucifixion. And so James White will be speaking. He's second, so I'm going to introduce Sami second. And then let me tell you about James. If you're unfamiliar with him, as I said, he's the director of Alpha and Omega Ministries. He's a Christian. That's a Christian apologetics organization that's based in Phoenix, Arizona. James is a professor. He's taught Greek and systematic theology and various topics in the field of apologetics. He's also an author and has authored or contributed to more than 20 different books. He's an accomplished debater, having engaged in over 100 moderated public debates with leading proponents of Roman Catholicism, Islam, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormonism, as well as other critics such as Bart Ehrman, John Dominic Crossman, Marcus Borg, and John Shelby Spong. He's an elder at the Phoenix Reformed Baptist Church. He's married to Kelly, has been for more than 28 years, and has 2 children, Joshua and Summer. And so let's give a warm welcome to James White, shall we? In a moment, I'm going to introduce Sami, but just a couple of housekeeping things. One, if you have something like this in your pocket, a phone, if you would just please put it on silent. Do have a check about that and mark that out. If you do need to use the facilities, if you would just go to the back, and one of the members of our church will direct you around so you can do that. Let me also at this time give you the format of our debate. We're going to begin with 2 25-minute openings by each of the speakers. That will be followed immediately by 2 12-minute rebuttals, and then a second round of 8-minute rebuttals by each of them. And we'll take a break after that for about 10 minutes, just a very short break, so you can take care of anything that you need and get some more refreshments if you'd like. And then following that, we're going to have what's called crossfire. And it's 90-second spots back and forth as each of the speakers get to bring each other in a very quick sort of staccato fashion some of their points and their questions and places of emphasis that they need to make. And then following that will be our 2 5-minute closings. So recognizing this is a midweek, we're trying to bring the time a little tighter than we might on Friday or Saturday night. Well, Sami is going to be speaking first. Sami Zaatari is an American-born Muslim of Palestinian-Iranian heritage. He's an international speaker for the Muslim Debate Initiative and the directors, we've just found out, and has taken part in several debates in both the United Kingdom and also the United States. Sami is extensively engaged in the field of interfaith apologetics, both in a debate setting as well as writing hundreds of articles on that related subjects. As well as being involved in the field of interfaith apologetics, Sami is also engaged in political commentary and analysis, and his articles are featured on various political websites. Sami has a BA in creative writing and a master's degree in the field of Middle East politics. So let's welcome our first speaker, Sami Zaatari.
All right, does it sound all right? All right, I'd first like to thank the church for inviting us here tonight for, I believe, the fourth debate in 4 years. And I also want to thank James White for joining us here. He's made a very long journey, and not just a long journey, America's truly a world away from here. So I'd like to thank him for coming as well. Now let's get straight to the topic. Now, tonight's topic is a very interesting one because tonight's topic is a true debate. Myself and Dr. James White are going to be arguing two completely opposite concepts. Both of us cannot be right tonight. Either one of us is right and the other is wrong, or both of us are wrong. But neither of us can be right because we're truly arguing two completely opposite things. So it is a debate. Now, it goes without saying that Islam and Christianity both have several similarities between each other. In fact, I'd say there's more similarities than differences. But one major difference between the two dominant faiths, Islam and Christianity, comes on the crucifixion, the cross. Now, as we all know, Orthodox Christianity teaches that Jesus died on the cross and was resurrected. The Gospels teach that, and that's what Orthodox Christianity teaches as well. Now, Islam, on the other hand, completely contradicts that. According to Islam, in Surah 4, chapter 4, verse 157, as James often says, 40 Arabic words deny that. According to the Quran, Jesus was neither killed nor was he crucified. So that completely contradicts the Christian claim. Now, there are some Muslims who have tried to bridge the gap, and so what they argue is that Jesus was on the cross, but he survived. And that's called the swoon theory, or the swoon hypothesis. Jesus was on the cross, he was crucified, but he was taken down alive. Now, I personally do not subscribe to this opinion, because the Quranic text is quite clear that he was neither killed nor crucified. And I think it is stretching the Arabic text when you argue that being not killed meant not killed by crucifixion. I think that's stretching it a bit. So I'm sure Dr. White will be happy about that, because I believe he's debated other people who've argued for the swoon theory. But that's not a position I hold. I take the Quranic text for what it says. Now, somebody might still argue, well, that's good, you're being consistent, but you still have another major problem, because history is against me. You know, after all, many Christian apologists often say that, forget about what the Bible says. Basically, every historian out there, including the skeptics and people like Bart Ehrman and the Jesus Seminar, they all agree that Jesus was crucified. So show me a single historian who says that Jesus wasn't crucified, a single non-Muslim historian. So it seems that I'm on the wrong side of history. Actually, I'm not. You see, something that's frustrated me a lot in these debates is that a Muslim has never actually said that that argument is a straw man. Muslims are not on the wrong side of history because the Quran does not deny the historical event of the crucifixion. The Quran says that an event, a crucifixion, did take place. It doesn't say that that never happened. What the Quran says was that wasn't Jesus who was on the cross. So it says the entire event happened, but it wasn't Jesus. Secondly, what does the Quran say as well? It says that that wasn't Jesus, and it was made to appear to the people that it was Jesus. So when you tell me a historian says that it was Jesus on the cross, or some first century Jew who says it was Jesus on the cross. That's what the Quran says. It says that they thought he was on the cross. So that doesn't contradict the Quran. That affirms what it's saying. So there's no contradiction and there's no being on the wrong side of history. That I need to emphasize that point. The Quran affirms the historical event. It just says it wasn't Jesus, but it was made to appear like Jesus. So therefore we'd expect people saying it was Jesus because it was made to appear to them. Now some might say, and this has come up in other debates, well, can you point me to any first century Jewish people who did not believe Jesus was on the cross? Show me first century Muslims. But that isn't a problem either, because I don't have to. Because the Quran never says there were first century Jews who believed that Jesus wasn't on the cross. The Quran never says that, so therefore I never have to show it for you. In fact, it's quite ironic that if I were to bring you first century Christians or Jews in mass numbers who believe that Jesus didn't die on the cross, that would prove the Quran wrong, because the Quran says they thought he was killed. But if they didn't think he was killed, then the Quran is proven wrong. So it's quite an irony. The argument works in the Quran's favor, not against it. Now, on the face of it, the Quranic claim cannot be disproven. There is no way to certainly disprove that it wasn't Jesus. Now, obviously, as a Christian, you believe that's wrong because the Bible says so. But I'm talking about the neutral person, the middleman, the historian who doesn't believe in the miraculous, or they think it's the least likelihood of what happened. There is no way for a historian to come and prove that it wasn't Jesus on the cross. Now, I don't have a problem if they don't believe that that happened because of their methodology, but that in no way hurts my faith or any other Muslim's faith. So we get that point out of the way. Now I'm sure what many of you will be thinking, well, what about the disciples? The disciples supposedly believed that Jesus died and rose from the dead, and we even have their writings. To begin with, we don't actually have any of their writings. The 4 Gospels are not written by the eyewitness disciples. What about 1 and 2 Peter? Academia says, and there is debate, but most academia, there's a consensus that 1 and 2 Peter were not written by the disciple Peter. Even if you read the Greek in 1 Peter, it's very highly advanced for an unlettered Galilean fisherman to be writing in such sophisticated Greek and using the Greek Old Testament rather than the Hebrew. And there's so many other arguments that can be put forward. The same with the epistles of John and so forth. But now that's too easy. I'm not going to simply use that argument and discount that. No, for the sake of argument, I'm going to give you the argument that the Gospels were written by the disciples, or they were transmitted by people who knew the disciples. I'll grant that argument. Now, according to the Gospels, Jesus was resurrected. They saw a resurrected Jesus. So how can I explain that away if that's authentic? And one way you can explain it, which is what a lot of historians do, is hallucinations. But I don't need to do that. There is a very easy solution to how people saw Jesus alive when he was supposedly dead. Now, to begin with, before we get to that, we need to establish one point. The first point to make clear is that none of the disciples actually witnessed Jesus dying on the cross. According to Mark chapter 14, verse 50, they all fled Jesus and forsook him. None of them were beside the cross. None of them actually witnessed his death. So how did they know that Jesus died? Obviously, from what they heard. Other people thought Jesus was dead, specifically his enemies, as the Quran says, it was made to appear to them. So obviously they went around saying, well, Jesus is dead. And that's from where the disciples heard it, because they never saw it. Now, if the disciples thought that Jesus was dead because of what they're hearing, and now they see an alive Jesus, naturally they will conclude that we heard he died, now he's alive, he must have been resurrected. But there's another solution to that which conforms with the Quran. According to the Quran, Jesus never died. So the Jesus they see, an alive Jesus, was a Jesus who never died, rather than being a Jesus who resurrected. And that is a very plausible explanation. So they didn't see a resurrected Jesus, they saw an alive Jesus who never died, as the Quran says. But what about them teaching that he rose from the dead? Why didn't they simply believe that he wasn't ever dead in the first place? Again, that can be easily explained. They misunderstood him. They misunderstood what happened. So my contention is that the disciples of Jesus mistook an alive Jesus for a resurrected Jesus. Now, in order to prove that, what I must do is show other examples of the disciples misunderstanding the message of Jesus. And if I can prove that, which I will, then the claim becomes very plausible that they misunderstood him as well when it came to this issue. Now, one of the biggest errors we find in the Gospels concerning the supposed message of Jesus was that he was an apocalyptic prophet. And in case some people don't understand what that means Jesus was a prophet who taught that the end of the world was imminent. Just like those modern day people who say the world is going to end in 2012 or in 2000 or sometime in the 80s. And we find these teachings straight from the Gospels. You can open your books and go to Matthew chapter 24 from verses 3 to 44. The disciples come to Jesus and they ask him, give us a sign of the last hour and when you will come. They're asking about the end times. So Jesus gives them a whole list of things that will happen. And he says, I'm going to come in the clouds and you're going to see me coming in the clouds. And then he says something very, very important and very interesting. Supposedly, he said this. According to Jesus, he said, assuredly, I tell you that this generation will not pass until these things come to pass. Now, as we all know, 2,000 years has passed. That generation is history. They're dust and bones, and Jesus has yet to return. In fact, that's not the only place where Jesus taught these apocalyptic teachings. He also taught them, supposedly, in Mark chapter 14, during the trial with the chief priests of the Pharisees. And so in Mark 14, verses 60 to 62, the high priest comes to Jesus and he says, are you the Son of Man, the one who's been preaching these things? And Jesus said, I am. And you will see me, he tells them, you will see me coming in the clouds on the right hand of power, etc. As we all know, that chief priest is long gone. And what's very interesting is Jesus is supposedly making a reference to Daniel. And the reference in Daniel about the Son of Man coming in the clouds is a reference about the end times. And as we all know, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. So these are clear apocalyptic teachings, and I can bring up many more. In fact, some of the Bible, some of the New Testament itself is telling other Christians that the end times is not coming. Why is that? This is a historical fact that there were many Christians who believed the end of the world was imminent. So some New Testament books, such as I believe it was 2 Thessalonians, and this is accepted by scholarship, was written by we don't know who to supposedly get rid of that problem and tell people that the world wasn't about to end. So there are three solutions to these false apocalyptic teachings. Jesus was wrong. He made false prophecies, just like many modern age people do. Or number two, the gospel authors who are supposedly the disciples or people transmitting from the disciples misunderstood the message of Jesus. Or number three, you could just add your own spin to it and ignore the clear context of the verse. And Dr. White might try to argue what the word generation means. Well, just for everybody, I have every single verse from the New Testament which mentions that word generation, and generation means generation as in a specific time frame. And I have all the verses right there. So when Jesus said that this generation will pass, it never did. And in fact, even Christian scholars have come out and said that that is an embarrassing verse in the Bible. So if they misunderstood him here, then it's very plausible that they misunderstood him there. But now the problems don't just end there. You see, my contention is that Jesus' disciples misunderstood an alive Jesus for a resurrected Jesus. In fact, one of the biggest problems for the supposed resurrection is the amount of contradictions between the narratives. Now, why is this important? The reason this is important is because I contend that a resurrection never happened, but they misunderstood a resurrection happened. Now, since they assumed a resurrection happened, they came up with their own way to conform a supposed resurrection with their own beliefs. Now, how can we prove this? Very simple. Contradictions within the story. Contradictions within the narrative proves that these people don't have any basis for the story, and in most likelihoods it's made up, which is why you find so many contradictions. And this is one of the biggest ironies. I've seen so many debates between Muslims or atheists and Christians on the crucifixion, and so many times I've seen the Christian apologists, namely William Lane Craig, who says, well, these contradictions don't matter. Actually, that's the basis of my argument. The reason why these contradictions matter is because they're the basis to show that there is no basis to the story. That's why the contradictions don't matter. So you can't simply turn around and say, they don't matter. They do. And here are the clear and explicit contradictions. Who did the woman see at the tomb? According to Mark 16, they saw one man in a white robe. According to Matthew, it's an angel. According to Luke 24, it's two men in shining robes. According to John 20, there's nobody at the tomb. Who went to the empty tomb? According to Mark 16, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. I think I mispronounced that. In Matthew chapter 28, it's Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. In John chapter 20, it's Mary Magdalene alone, who's later followed by Peter and the other disciple. Where did all the 11 disciples see Jesus together? The Great Commission. According to Matthew chapter 28, it's in Galilee. According to Luke and Acts, it's in Jerusalem. Both can be right. In fact, we even see an evolution of the story of the supposed empty tomb. According to Mark chapter 16, when the ladies arrive at the tomb, the stone is already moved away. According to Matthew chapter 28, a great earthquake happens and an angel comes down and he's like lightning and he rolls the stone away. Here are some more evolution to the story. Were there guards at the empty tomb? According to Mark, there's nothing, no guards. According to Matthew chapter 27, guards are placed at the tomb because they're afraid that his disciples might steal the body. According to Luke, no guards. According to John, no guards. All these contradictions, all these changes in the story are proof that there really is no basis to the story, and people are making these stories up to conform with their supposed belief that Jesus rose from the dead. Now I have a question for everybody. If somebody came up to you, some businessman, and he told you to invest all your life savings into his business venture, and all the numbers he was giving you were filled with contradictions, would you give him your life investment? None of you would. In fact, I doubt any of you would give your life investment even if his numbers did add up. But if you wouldn't give your life investment to a man, a businessman who is contradicting himself, something like money, which basically is worthless, we make the value up, something like paper, which has no value, you wouldn't give that up. So why do you expect me and billions of other people to place our salvation, our soul, which has a value, in these stories that are filled with contradictions? If you wouldn't do it with a businessman with your own money, don't expect me to do it with a book in which my hereafter lies in. And if you want to do it, don't expect me. Consistency. But now let's look at the theological issues as well, because there's a lot of theological problems with the supposed crucifixion of Jesus. Now, the first thing we need to ask, was the crucifixion even needed? According to Christian apologists, atonement must be made for sin. Your sin needs to be punished. You can't just get away with it. So someone had to die for you. Well, according to the Bible, sin was already being forgiven before Jesus. The baptism in Mark chapter 1. People were getting baptized for the remission of sin. In fact, here's an irony. Jesus forgave sin, and according to you, that makes him God. But if Jesus could easily forgive someone of their sins, such as in Mark chapter 2, then why does he have to die? He was forgiving those people without any atonement. And what about your prayer? The prayer you make to God, as Jesus taught you in Matthew chapter 6, verses 9 to 15. According to Jesus, when you pray, you are supposed to forgive somebody. And if you forgive somebody, God will forgive you. So according to Jesus, all you have to do to remove your sin is forgive the other person. No atonement, no sacrifice on the cross. And we need to ask ourselves, what about all the people who came beforehand? Are they all damned to hell? And not only the Jews who had the Jewish Bible, there were other races other than the Jews around the world 4,000 years ago. What about all those people who didn't have a Bible, who didn't have the Old Testament? Are they all condemned to hell because they didn't have that specific way of repentance, because there was no atonement? Obviously not. So if there was a way to be saved back then, without the cross, then no matter what way you look at it, the cross was not really needed. Now let's go to another point. Is the death of Jesus even just? Many Christians say you have to atone for your sin. Sin cannot go unpunished. Well, if that's the case, why don't you be consistent and punish the sinner instead of the innocent man? According to your own doctrine, Jesus was an innocent, sinless man. So according to you, the way to get rid of sin, you go to a court, you're the criminal, and all you have to do is tell the judge, I accept this innocent man to take my crime, and the judge tells you, well, since you accept him as the one to take your crime, you're now pardoned. Does that sound just to you? Is that actually getting rid of the sin, or is that transferring the sin onto someone who is not responsible for the sin? Take responsibility for yourself. That's a big problem we have in humanity. People always want to put the blame on somebody else. In this case, I'll just get rid of all of my sins and put it on Jesus, and everything is good. And here's another big problem with the crucifixion. You see, at the end of the day, no matter what way you look at it, you guys believe in a human ritualistic sacrifice. The atonement is all about an innocent human who was sacrificed for your sins. This is no different to ancient pagan religions and ancient cults who also believed in human sacrifices. In fact, in the ancient days, this is even in the Bible, there was an idol named Moloch, and they would sacrifice their little babies to this idol. And we see this in several ancient cultures. Now, why would they sacrifice babies? The reason they sacrifice babies is because they're innocent, they're pure, and that's why they sacrifice them, because they're the perfect sacrifice. Now, Jesus wasn't a baby, but he was pure, he was innocent, so the concept is exactly the same. You see, because Christianity is a mainstream religion, I believe the largest in the world with 2 billion followers, because it's a mainstream faith, people look at it differently. They don't really look at it and say, well, in reality, this is a human sacrifice, no different to those ancient cults and religions which had human sacrifices as well. Your entire faith rests on a human sacrifice, not according to me, but according to the Apostle Paul, who himself wrote that without the crucifixion of Jesus and his raising from the dead, your faith is in vain. So if there was no human sacrifice, your faith is null and void. So in order to guarantee your salvation, you need to believe in the ritualistic sacrifice of an innocent man named Jesus to atone for your salvation, which is really no different than the ancient pagan cults. I say something more simple. No innocent man has to die for you. And if you want to atone for your sin, you atone to God, you become a better person, or you yourself get punished instead of another innocent person. And I could bring up a whole lot of other theological problems with this. I mean, even the Jews even say that they don't need a human sacrifice to get rid of their sin. So what about them? And they're using the same book you're using. So why don't they see what you see in their Old Testament that supposedly points to a crucifixion. And another point to make is Jesus is the Messiah, and there is no Jewish belief that the Messiah was going to be killed by his enemies. No Jewish person believes that he would be killed by his enemies. The fact that the Quran says that Jesus was saved shows that he's the true Messiah, because he truly conquered his enemies and he truly conquered death by not dying. How do you conquer death when you die? That's not conquering it. Conquering death is not by dying and by surviving. Anyway, I have 5 seconds left, and I'll end it on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sami. Just before James comes and he's going to give his 25-minute, wanted to welcome some others that are really not in this room but are also present with us. This morning and this afternoon, through the hard work of a friend of mine by the name of Alex Crane and Philip, they've been able to connect together. So there's a live stream of the debate happening just as we speak. It's found on Christianity.com. If you're not familiar with that, you can go to Christianity.com and there's a link available. We presently have, I think, just about 300 individuals who are also watching in right at the moment. And I was just speaking to Alex, and he said the number's rising quite rapidly. So there'll be several hundred people that are going to be joining in with us and watching. Well, let's welcome James White as he comes and gives his 25 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. And of course, thank you to Sami for being here again. I believe the first debate that we did here was with Sami about 4 years ago now. And so obviously he must like us because he keeps coming back. So that's a good thing. It is a very important subject that we have this evening. And let me just start off, since it's fresh on my mind, by pointing out that what we believe about the cross of Jesus Christ could not be any less like pagan sacrifices. Because, of course, the one who gave himself did so voluntarily. He was the creator who had entered into his own creation, and he did what we could not do for ourselves. It was not the taking of a sinful life by another sinful individual. It was the giving of a sinless life voluntarily by one who was doing so out of love, which is a completely different concept, utterly unknown in any type of pagan context whatsoever. And that is why in Galatians chapter 4, Christians say, "But may it never be that I would boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, through which the world has been crucified to me and I to the world." The cross is central to the experience of every single Christian. Every single day when we rise, we believe that we have peace with God, not because of anything within ourselves, because we know our own hearts. We know we cannot atone for our own sins. We know there's no cleaning up this man so that I can stand before a holy God. You'd have to have a much less holy God than the true God of the Bible for my washings to have any avail before him. There has to be another way. There has to be a way in which I can have a perfect righteousness, and we believe that that righteousness is imputed to us because of what Jesus did upon the cross of Calvary. Now, that is not just a modern belief. That has been the belief of Christians all along. Around AD 107, a man by the name of Ignatius of Antioch was going to Rome to die a martyr's death. And as he went, he wrote letters to churches and individuals. And in one of those letters, he said, "I glorify Jesus Christ, the God, notice very early on belief in the deity of Christ, the God who made you so wise, for I saw that you were established in an unshakable faith, having been nailed, as it were, to the cross of the Lord Jesus Christ in both body and spirit, and firmly established in love by the blood of Christ, totally convinced with regard to our Lord that he is truly of the family of David with respect to human descent, Son of God with respect to the divine will and power, truly born of a virgin, baptized by John in order that all righteousness might be fulfilled by him, truly nailed in the flesh for us under Pontius Pilate," notice the historicity of the crucifixion, "and Herod the Tetrarch. From its fruit we derive our existence, that is, from his divinely blessed suffering. in order that he might raise a banner for the ages through his resurrection for his saints and faithful people, whether among Jews or among Gentiles, in the one body of his church. This is the first generation after the apostles themselves testifying of the centrality of the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, historically, scholarship, whether believing and conservative or unbelieving and liberal, acknowledges that Jesus of Nazareth died in the early 4th decade of the 1st century, and that by crucifixion. We have more evidence of the time and method of Jesus' death than for almost any person in all of ancient history. Every documentable source that can be meaningfully placed in the first 100 years after Jesus' death, that is prior to about AD 130, says the same thing. Jesus of Nazareth died upon a Roman cross outside of Jerusalem. The sources that testify to this include the aforementioned Ignatius of Antioch, who was martyred around AD 107 and 108. We have also the Epistle of Clement to the Corinthians, dated as early as AD 95, clearly makes reference to the common belief of Christians in the death of Jesus Christ. It says, Jesus Christ our Lord, in accordance with God's will, gave his blood for us, belief in atonement, and his flesh for our flesh, and his life for our lives, in verse 49. Another early Christian leader, Polycarp, makes reference to the death of Christ in his letters as well. He is dated concurrently with both Ignatius and Clement. Josephus makes reference to Jesus in Antiquities 28, 63 through 64, and it's highly unlikely that the portion about Jesus' death is a later Christian interpolation. This is around AD 85. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around AD 115, makes derogatory reference to the early Christian movement and mentions the founder of the movement had been executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. That was meant to be a put-down. There simply is no evidence of conflict or confusion on the matter of Jesus' death by crucifixion in these sources. In fact, John Dominic Crossan, a man that I have debated on the reliability of the Gospels, in his book, Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography, said that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be, since both Josephus and Tacitus agree with the Christian accounts on at least that basic fact. And another man that I have debated, Bart Ehrman, said in The Historical Jesus, Part 2, page 162, one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Now, of course, from our perspective, the New Testament witness is extremely important. And that is the multiple testimony that we get from the New Testament corpus. Despite the skepticism of atheists and liberals, the New Testament presents to us multiple streams of witness, with important elements of that witness coming from within less than a matter of a few years from the time of the death of Jesus. The testimony included in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 through 5, provides an ancient creedal statement of the church, which includes the direct assertion of the crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection of Christ. These words predate Paul's use of them by a number of years, placing them in the most primitive possible time frame, some believe within 18 months of the actual events themselves. The Pauline corpus of writings presents to us firm, contextual, historical witness to the belief in the crucifixion of Jesus, dating to as early as AD 48. Given that his letters were sent to cities all around the Mediterranean, clearly the belief in the death of Christ by crucifixion was widespread, despite how repulsive the idea was to the intellectual elite of that particular day. There is no compelling reason, outside of embracing naturalistic principles, to date the Gospels as late as most modern scholarship. Strong internal arguments can be presented for a pre-AD 70 date for the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if, in fact, Luke Acts was meant to be an amicus brief for Paul's trial, remember he was arrested by the Romans on charges by the Jews, this would put Mark, if it was written earlier, into the mid-40s for the time of its compilation. Theologically, the crucifixion is central and definitional to the entirety of the proclamation of the gospel itself. It is the self-giving of God in his Son, the reality of his wrath, the necessity of atonement, the perfection of the God-man's work as high priest, as sacrifice, and as mediator that forms the very bedrock of the Christian message itself. Hence, we have a unanimous witness to the crucifixion from every relevant source within the first century of the time of Christ's death. Remember, the majority of what Muslims believe about Muhammad has no literary testimony until well after 100 years after his death. So is the Muslim consistent in his application of standards at this point? We will be looking at that carefully. There is only one reason, I submit to you, why Islam denies the crucifixion. And as Sami pointed out, 40 Arabic words written 600 years after the events of Christ's life. Only 40. There is only one ayah in all of the Quran that denies this. And if it wasn't there, there would be two other ayah that would seem to talk about the death of Christ. Surah 355 and 1933. Well, what is that ayah? Well, you've already heard, Surah 4, 157. But we need to think about what it says. That they, the Jews, said in boast, we killed the Messiah, Christ. In Arabic, it's the Messiah. Jesus, the son of Mary, the apostle of Allah. But they killed him not, nor crucified him, but so it was made to appear to them. Halam is a very important term we're going to have to look at a lot this evening. That's what's translated as it was made to appear to them. And those who differ therein are full of doubts with no certain knowledge, but only conjecture to follow, for of a surety they killed him not. Now, my friends, this ayah is not mubinun. It is not clear. There are so many questions we can ask about it that Muslims have argued about for a long time now. For example, do Jews call Jesus the Messiah? We killed the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary. Would Jews actually boast about this? But then it says, but they killed him not. Who? The only antecedents, the Jews. We don't say the Jews did. It's the Romans that did. So could the Romans have done it, but the Jews didn't? The text doesn't seem to say. Now, if this came from a book that interacted a great deal with the New Testament, we might be able to have some basis for dealing with it. But the fact of the matter is there are no New Testament citations in the Quran. There is no evidence that I have found, even in writing a book on the subject of the Quran over the past year and a half or so, that the author of the Quran had any first-hand knowledge of the testimony of the Gospels or any of the New Testament as a whole. And so what does it mean? It says, they killed him not. The Jews did not kill him, or he was not killed at all. Because it says later on, they killed him not, of a surety, but is that still just talking about the Jews? There are people that have interpreted it that way. And why does it say, and I appreciate the fact, this is one of the reasons I wanted to debate with Sami on this, is, it's frustrating to debate the Ahmadi view of this, with the swoon theory and stuff like that. It's very difficult, and that doesn't represent the vast majority of Muslims anyways. I would say that Sami's position does represent the vast majority of Muslims, and so that's what makes this debate so valuable, and so I thank him for that. But then it says, they killed him not, nor crucified him. Well, why say the two? Because I can guarantee you something. History tells us that if you're crucified, you're going to die. History tells us of one man in all of recorded history who received a partial crucifixion. He didn't receive the death blow. He received a partial crucifixion, and he survived. That's one. There were tens and even hundreds of thousands of people who were crucified. And we know of one that survived the process. So why is it divided up like that? And what does Shubi Halaham mean? What does it mean it was made to appear to them? There are translations of the Quran that actually say, he was made to appear to them. Well, that's not what it says. It simply says, it was made to appear. What was made to appear? I know the vast majority of Muslims believe someone else was put in Jesus' place. The substitution theory. And most Muslims I've talked to think it was Judas. I had one send me a long email once proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was Simon the Cyrene. And given the number of colors and boldface he used in his email, that proved the point to me. I don't know about the rest of it. And he was absolutely certain of it, It was, don't worry, it wasn't Sami. He didn't send me an email like that. How do we know? How would the disciples have not known? Well, they weren't there. Well, actually, according to the gospel testimonies, some of them were there. And the women who were at the foot of the cross, who had actually provided for the ministry of Jesus, certainly would have known the difference. So was there some type of a miracle going on where he's transfigured into what somebody that looks like Jesus? There are Muslims that actually believe that. Is that really what this text is saying? That's a good question. And then the next ayah says this, verse 158. Nay, Allah raised him up. Rafahu. Raised him up unto himself, and Allah is exalted in power and wise. Now, Muhammad Assad has pointed out that every time that root Raf is used in the Quran, it does not mean to actually lift somebody up off the planet. It literally means to exalt them and to honor and to glorify them. But most Muslims I know believe this means that God took Jesus. In fact, I've had Muslims make entire arguments about, well, in the place where Jesus and the disciples met in the Mount of Olives, they found the cave that they would have slept in, and there's a hole in the middle. That's how Jesus got out. Was Allah brought him up through the hole in the middle of the roof. So is that what Surah 4:158 means? Well, these are questions that have to be asked, and we're going to have to ask, because I didn't hear Sami, if he addressed Surah 4:158, I didn't hear it, but if you would, I would really appreciate that. It's a question I'm going to be asking about. Now, there is no authentic interpretation of this one ayah to be found in the Hadith literature. Now, that to me is amazing. No Muslim for 200 years could remember anything Muhammad said about this one ayah. And that troubles me. It troubles me because if you know Sahih al-Bukhari 6, 509 and 510, there are at least 2 ayahs in the Quran that were found with only one person in the compilation of the Quran, both at the time of Abu Bakr and then at the time of Uthman. One person remembered it. Where did this one come from? Why isn't there any commentary on this? On all sorts of other places. If Sami and I were debating Surah 5:116, we could go to the Hadith and we could find all sorts of commentary. We could find things that Muhammad said. And if we were talking about the end of the opening surah of the Quran, when it talks about those who earn God's wrath and those who are misguided, I could go to the Hadith and I could show you numerous places where Muhammad said, well, that's the Jews and that's the Christians, and we could go to that. We can't here. There is no authentic interpretation that we can go to. And the context gives us nothing. We simply have 40 isolated Arabic words written 600 years after the events without any connection to what was going on at that time that stand against all of history. That's what we have in this situation. Now, I've already mentioned, what Jewish person would ever call Jesus Messiah? What does it mean to appear to them? Appear to whom? Surah 355 and 1933 both speak of Jesus' death, as long as you translate them correctly. Surah 1933 is parallel to Surah 1915, where the words are applied to John the Baptist. Remember how John the Baptist died, everybody? He was beheaded. I can guarantee you, he died. No one ever survives that one. And the exact same words are used of John the Baptist's death that are used of Jesus in 1933. Again, if this one strange verse were not in the Quran, there wouldn't be any question here. You wouldn't have the entirety of the Quran standing against all of recorded history. So where did it come from? And why should we reject everything that we have in the New Testament that goes back to the time of Jesus, including the prophetic fulfillments of Jesus' self-giving sacrifice that go before that, based upon the words of one individual who was over 700 miles away, 600 years later in a different language? But that's what we're being asked to do in that particular situation. So again, 40 Arabic words, 625 years after the ministry of Jesus, 765 miles Jerusalem, no first-hand contact, completely different language. That's the basis of why we should reject what that says. Now, Sami didn't do that, and I'm thankful, but this is just my opening statement. I'll get to his materials in a moment. But in an amazing example of inconsistency, Muslims in modern times, and you can go online and find this all over the place. It is amazing. And this is sort of rather interesting for us tonight in light of events today, if you've been following the news. Muslims in modern times relied themselves on ancient polytheists, those who denied there was a creator God named the Gnostics. Yeah, those nasty Gnostics again. Proving the old axiom, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, many Muslim apologists are quick to embrace the assertions of the Gnostics despite the fact that Gnosticism is clearly not consistent with the views of Jesus that they themselves hold. Muslims fail to understand why, beginning in the middle of the 2nd century, Gnostics began denying the crucifixion of Jesus. The reason is simple. Gnostics are dualists. They believe that which is spirit is good and that which is material is evil. Jesus was good, hence, in direct contradiction of the Bible and of Islam, they denied Jesus had a physical body. Obviously, it's very difficult to crucify a spirit. Think about that one for a moment, you'll figure out why. The Gnostic religion is completely contrary to both Christianity and Islam. They identified the creator of the physical world as an evil deity, and they were polytheists, preaching an entire body of divine beings emanating from the one true spiritual God. One of those beings, far removed from the spiritual God, a demiurge, created the physical universe. That means the Gnostics would identify Allah as an evil deity. They're not your friends. Every Muslim using Gnostic sources is relying upon pagan polytheism for his arguments, and if you want to see it, just go online tonight. It's all over the place. I'm thankful that Sami did not go there. The Gnostics did not care about history. They did not care about doctrine. Salvation for them did not involve faith in the truth, but instead involved gaining esoteric knowledge, gnosis, through secret ceremonies, allowing them to find the path to full enlightenment and eventually freedom from the physical body, hence their mockery of the resurrection. Now, we did hear, however, Sami say that there's no need for the atonement. And we do have a quotation here from Yusuf Ali on Surah 4:157, where he says, the Orthodox Christian churches make it a cardinal point of their doctrine that his life was taken on the cross, that he died and was buried, that on the third day he rose in the body with his wounds intact, and walked about and conversed, and ate with his disciples, and was afterward taken up bodily to heaven. This is necessary for the theological doctrine of blood sacrifice and vicarious atonement for sins, which is rejected by Islam. The Quranic teaching is that Christ was not crucified nor killed by the Jews, notwithstanding certain apparent circumstances which produced that illusion in the minds of some of his enemies. Well, here's the problem. It also produced that illusion in the minds of all of his friends. Now, the explanation that's been given by Sami was, well, see, he never died, and so when they encountered him again, then they thought he had been resurrected. Main problem with that's rather simple. First of all, the women were the first ones to tell him about the resurrection, and they were the ones that put the cross. Okay? And secondly, don't you think Jesus would have said something to them? Guys, it wasn't me. You don't have, no, see the wound prints in my hands? Feel the side? Once they said, we've seen a phantasma, a ghost, a spirit, Jesus would have said, what are you talking about, guys? Don't you notice Judas is missing? He was the one on the cross, it wasn't me. I mean, he's got 40 days. And what are we told he's doing during those 40 days? He's opening their minds to understand the Scriptures, the necessity of the fact that the Christ must suffer and die. See Luke chapter 24. And so obviously, if they had just encountered the living Jesus, Jesus would have said, guys, I've not died, I am not resurrected, and that's why we do need to look at Surah 4:158 and see if Sami understands that to be related to 157 and to be related to Jesus being taken up or not, because again, I think he will confirm many Muslims do understand it that way. I'm not making something up here. That is a perspective that has been taken by many people before. Now, obviously, we do have fundamental differences, and I'll talk during my rebuttal period about the issue of the atonement. I did a little bit at the beginning. But let me just simply emphasize the fact that from the biblical perspective, we had all the way back in the Old Testament literature, we had in the prophecies of the Jews, the discussion of the one who would come, who would be a suffering servant. Both in Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22, you have an incredible discussion of the self-giving sacrifice of this one who by his suffering would justify the many. Now, Sami will ask, well, why didn't the Jews see that? Well, all the early disciples were Jews, so many of them did. But there's a lengthy discussion in the New Testament of why it is that there has become a hardening upon the Jews so that the gospel would go out to the Gentiles. This is part of the entire discussion of the meaning of the gospel in that early period of time. But there can be no question that all of the Christians of the first century believed in the atoning sacrifice of Jesus. And so my question for anyone who would say, well, there were other Jews that didn't believe in the deity of Christ, and they didn't believe in the crucifixion, where are they? Where are the disciples of Jesus that do not believe these things? Show me a single disciple of Jesus in the first century beginning of the 2nd century, and anybody in the 2nd century who isn't a Gnostic, who actually denied the crucifixion. They all believed it. Was it because they had all been fooled? But if they had met the living Jesus, how could that be? He would have corrected them. And so what's my summary argument this evening? Well, the unanimous testimony of the relevant historical sources in the 1st century, after Jesus, all testified to his crucifixion in Jerusalem under Pontius Pilate. Both secular and religious sources testify to this fact in numerous ways, as we have mentioned. And again, if he was not crucified and yet he met with his disciples after that time of crucifixion, then there would have been disciples contradicting this story. Unless you're going to say that those true disciples were all just swallowed up or taken off the planet or didn't have the guts to stand up for the truth against the falsehood that was being proclaimed in Jesus' name. Non-historical Gnostic Gospels and movements in the 2nd and 3rd centuries deny the crucifixion for purely theological, mystical reasons, and as such are utterly irrelevant to any serious, truthful examination of the issue. And so we return to the main issue. 40 Arabic words, without context, over 600 years removed, that are themselves unclear and are nothing but themselves speculation because they have no connection to the 1st century. The Christian has a consistent message of God's saving purpose in Jesus Christ to offer every Muslim, and that's why we preach the cross to you. We don't worship the cross. We worship the one who gave himself on the cross, because it is by his sacrifice that we have life and peace with God. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. We're about to move into our second round. This is 2 12-minute rebuttals. Now that you know what the issues are very clearly, as both Sami and James gave them, they'll be looking at one another's arguments and taking time, each of them, to bolster their points by bringing rebuttals to those to their opponents. So Sami's going to speak first, and then James will follow me.
All right. Thank you for that presentation. This should be fun. But there's a lot of points to respond to, so I'll try to get them all. I've listed them all in order. Now, the first point about the pagan sacrifices is different, because Jesus was he voluntarily did it on his own. He stood up, he wasn't forced to do it, and so forth. First of all, not all ancient pagan sacrifices were by force. But even assuming that all historical sacrifices, human sacrifices, were done by force, it doesn't change the fact that this is still a human sacrifice. So whether they were doing it by force and Jesus is more pure than them, it doesn't change the main point that it is still a human sacrifice. Then the second point about Jesus being on the cross is about perfect righteousness. You know, that's the best way to get atoned, righteousness. I argue that it isn't, because all you're doing is transferring your sin onto an innocent man. So in essence, you're not taking responsibility, you're just blaming somebody else. That would be like me going to court and telling the judge, I accept this person to take my crime, and then the judge says, well, now you're good for eternal salvation. That doesn't sound just to me. The third point was about scholarship affirms Jesus' death in large numbers, and then you even have the historical sources such as the early Christian writings, and even Josephus, who wasn't a Christian, and then Clement, and so forth. As I already addressed that in my opening, those points don't hurt the Islamic position, because Islam does not deny the historical event. It denies that it was Jesus on the cross. So if you tell me people are saying that it was Jesus on the cross, that's what the Quran says. It was made to appear to them. So therefore, that's what I would logically expect. Then James brought up the point about, well, what does the Quran say? The Quran says that the Jews were going around saying they killed the Messiah. But the Jews don't believe that he was the Messiah, and everybody started giggling about that. When they said they killed the Messiah, they were doing this in jest, mocking him. They weren't actually serious about it. In fact, let's now be consistent. If you want to giggle at that, you're going to have to giggle at your own Gospels. Because according to Mark chapter 15, verse 13, not only did they crucify him, they called him the King of Jews. That was the title on the cross, supposedly. The King of Jews. And there's so many other references where they made all of these mocking. So if it's okay for the Bible to say that, why don't you grant the same response to the Quran? Inconsistency. And then the point about, well, the Jews didn't kill Jesus, it was the Romans. I'd suggest you go read 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 14 to 16. It says the Jews were responsible for his death. That's what it says, not me. Then what about the point that the only reason we Muslims don't believe in the crucifixion of Jesus is because of 40 Arabic words? Well, there's many things you Christians believe in that nobody else believes in because of your own Bible. So that's not really an argument. In fact, think of this. If the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a false prophet and he was trying to trick all of you, wouldn't it make more sense to confirm a teaching that is so widely accepted rather than go against it? Why wouldn't he simply do the easy thing and say, yeah, Jesus died on the cross? Why say something completely opposite? It would be much more easier for him to simply go with that belief. But nonetheless, exactly, just because we believe in it because of our Quran doesn't mean anything. And yes, we do believe it because we believe the Quran is the truth. And that's a whole separate debate for me to show that. But just like you believe in things that nobody else believes in, because of your Bible. And there are so many things that you believe in which are just historically wrong, scientifically wrong, that nobody believes in. For instance, young earth creationists. People say, well, they're crazy, but actually they're consistent because they've looked at all the time frames of the Bible and have come to that conclusion. So you can believe the earth is 6,000 years old. We know nobody believes that, but if you read the Bible properly, it says that. And so they are consistent. Now, what about what happened to Jesus according to the Quran? Can you explain what exactly happened on the cross? Because there's no authentic Islamic interpretation about Surah 4, 157. I mean, who was on the cross instead? How was he saved? Was he saved on the cross? Was he saved before the cross? And so forth. Those points are all irrelevant. And the reason being is because the Quran tells us the main relevant point, that it wasn't Jesus and that he survived. That's all I need to know. Everything else is just trying to be picky and just argue for the sake of argument. On these main points, there's no debate. Jesus was on the cross, Jesus was not on the cross, and he did not die. And I find it ironic. James White says that there's so many contradictory interpretations of what exactly happened. Contradictory interpretations, not contradictory verses. But think about the irony. James White and many people in the audience might think that that's an argument. Well, this scholar says that and that scholar says that. Isn't that a problem? What about the contradictions in your own Bible about the story? Forget about interpretations. Your own Bible has contradictions about the very same story. So if you have problems with contradictions between interpretations, and there are barely any, then I think you'd have more problems with contradictions in your own holy Bible about the story. And I brought all the contradictions. I don't need to repeat them. Inconsistency. So that point is out of the way. Now, what about the point Jesus came to his disciples? Why didn't he tell them, I'm alive, I never died. Hey, I'm not Judas. First of all, Islam never says it was Judas. So that's a straw man. The Quran never says that. No hadith says that. So why would he say that? And then James says, well, he was with them for 40 days. That's your belief, not mine. There's no actually proof that he was with them for 40 days. In fact, according to the Gospel of Mark, which is the earliest Gospel, which ends in verse 13, the rest has been added. And if you take away the ending of Mark's Gospel, it says nothing about the disciples seeing a resurrected Jesus. The earliest Gospel has nothing about a resurrected Jesus. And it's an accepted academic fact. You can choose to reject it, but that's academia. It's a consensus that the ending of Mark, which talks about the post-appearances of Jesus, have all been added to it. And that actually proves my point in my presentation. In my presentation, I said the resurrection accounts have no basis. They were simply making these things up. The ending of Mark proves that. They literally made it up and put it in there. And it goes to the other point. The woman came to the tomb and they saw resurrected Jesus. Mary. I don't have to believe that. There's actually no strong evidence for that to be authentic. What's the basis of that? I'm not simply saying I don't believe in it because I don't like it. I don't believe in it because there are full of contradictions of that account which tells me that something's up. And as for Jesus, why didn't he tell them, hey, I'm alive? Maybe he did. Who said he stayed with them for 40 days? I never said he stayed with them for 40 days. His post-appearance could have been a simple appearance where he told them, I'm alive, and now go do this. And they still could have misunderstood him. There's absolutely no proof beyond any evidence, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that he was with them for 40 days and telling them to look at his wounds and what have you. And as for the woman who saw Jesus on the cross, actually, the Gospels say they saw it from afar. And so that point is out of the way. Now, what about the Quranic verse that talks about Jesus' death? In Surah 19, verse 33, where Jesus said, peace on me the day I'm born, the day I die, and so forth. Which is like what John says in the Quran. Very simple. Jesus is talking about the day he will die. He hasn't died yet. He's talking about the future event when he will die. We Muslims don't believe that Jesus is immortal. We believe he will eventually die. If I come up here right now and say peace on me while I'm alive and peace on me the day I'm dead, does that mean I'm a ghost right now speaking to you? No, it means I'm talking about a future event that will take place. And yes, Jesus will die one day. And that's what the Quranic verse is talking about. And that's what all Muslims believe. And then there was the last point. Jesus' death is all over the Jewish Bible. And why don't the Jews believe it? But the early disciples were Jews and they believed in Jesus' death and resurrection. Actually, if you read the gospel accounts, supposing that they're authentic accounts, the disciples were shocked by Jesus' death. And they were surprised and doubtful of his resurrection. A resurrection, by the way, that's nowhere in Mark. These are the later gospels which talk about the post-appearances. Now ask yourself, why would the disciples be surprised about Jesus dying and rising from the dead if he clearly taught it to them according to the Gospels, and if the Old Testament clearly taught it? Did they just get mass amnesia? Did they just forget that? When Jesus clearly told them, I will die and rise in 3 days in Jerusalem, expect me, and everything happens as he supposedly says, why are they still surprised? He told them, the Old Testament prophesied it, but they're still doubtful, they're still sad. The consistent answer to that, the reason why they were sad, the reason why they were surprised, the reason why they never expected it, is because it was never taught. That way it comes together and there's no contradictions. So I believe those were all of his points, and there's nothing much more to add. Thank you.
All right, so much to get to in such a brief period of time. I haven't gotten clarity yet on what Surah 4:158 means. Does it mean that Jesus was taken to Allah? Now, interestingly, many of the questions that I asked were just dismissed. It was very interesting. All the questions that we can ask about the text are said to be irrelevant and being picky. Now, here we have a text that's going against everything else history has recorded. We have a text that's nowhere else reiterated in the Quran. There's no other ayah that repeats this. There's no interpretation in the Hadith. All we have is 40 Arabic words. And when we ask why it's not clear, When we ask why it says they did not do this, well, the antecedents, the Jews, and what about the Romans, or what about somebody else? We ask these questions. That's irrelevant. You're just being picky. Can you imagine if someone came along 600 years after Muhammad, claimed to be a prophet, gave one verse denying his night flight to Jerusalem, which is extremely important. I mean, his ascension to heaven, the night flight to Jerusalem, all the things associated with that in Islamic theology. A guy comes along 600 years later, says that never happened. And he gives one verse that says it never happened. And then you start asking questions. Well, what about this? It's irrelevant, being picky. Just accept what I say. And we're supposed to accept the overthrow of the entire testimony of the martyr church and those disciples themselves based upon that, or based upon the fact that the women were not standing exactly at the foot of the cross, but they were in the back of the room? I mean, I think those of you in the back of the room would know whether I was speaking up here or whether Doug McMasters took my place to the rebuttal. He's a foot taller than me. We both glow about the same, but he's much better looking than I am. And I don't care if you were across the street, you'd still be able to tell the difference. To dismiss the women's testimony because they were watching from afar off doesn't mean they were on the other side of Jerusalem. That means the women probably did not want to be standing in the middle of the Roman soldiers. But they were watching the events, and their testimony is very, very clear. Now, there's just so many things that we need to get to here. Let me just start going through all of these things. Basically, Sam has already said, hey, look, if Surah 417 is true, then historians should say that Jesus was crucified because that's how God made it to look that way. Well, there's a problem with that. It's one of the reasons there are a lot of Western Muslims that don't buy this particular perspective. Because in essence, God started Christianity by mistake. He did such a good job in fooling everybody that Jesus was crucified that he started a religion that has produced a tremendous amount of shirk by mistake. Why would he do that? What was the accomplishment in putting somebody else upon the cross and making them look like Jesus? And can we prove that Shabi Halaha means that someone else was made to look like that? Now, he said it was a straw man for me to mention Judas. Is it not, for you Muslims, is it not the majority view you'd find in the Muslim world? I said there were other theories out there. The Quran doesn't say, the Hadith doesn't say, but is that not the majority perspective out there? It most assuredly is the majority perspective out there. Then we had, if the disciples, as I said, if they met a living Jesus, and evidently in the opening, Sami admitted, based upon the gospel accounts, that they encountered Jesus. But how does Sami know they encountered Jesus? The Quran doesn't say they encountered Jesus, does it? No, it doesn't. So his opening said that they did encounter Jesus, but it was just because he had not died. Okay, but it's the very Gospels that he then says we can't trust because they allegedly contradict each other, that he's relying upon to say that Jesus met them, because the Quran doesn't tell him that. So which is it going to be? And if the living Jesus met the disciples, he would have corrected them. He says, well, maybe he did. Okay, then we need evidence from the first century. These disciples would have been constantly fighting against all this proclamation that Jesus died, because if they love Jesus, they're not going to allow lies about Jesus to be preached in Jesus' name, are they? And so where's the evidence that anybody in the first century knew that Jesus had not died upon the cross? Where is the evidence? If it is true, because it's, well, a crucifixion took place. Yeah, but of somebody else. All that evidence was saying it was Jesus that was crucified, not somebody else. So where are the true disciples that Jesus met and that he corrected and said, guys, I didn't die? Where's their preaching? Where's the record of their existence? If you can't find it, you're still left with 40 Arabic words all by themselves 600 years later, and every other scintilla of evidence standing against that position. It was said that none of the disciples were eyewitnesses. Well, that ignores the rest of the Gospels. The very Gospels that Sami depends upon to know that Jesus met with the disciples. The other Gospels say that, for example, Peter, yes, he initially flees, but then he follows into the courtyard. And John, likewise, goes in. That's what the testimony of the rest of the Gospels. You're picking and choosing at that particular point in time. Then we had all this stuff, well, you can't really trust what the Gospels say because they're so contradictory. I have been teaching through the Synoptic Gospels now for almost a decade. And we're now getting to this very section. And I can tell you, it's not easy, but every single one of these alleged contradictions, if Sammy and I could just sit down with them, if he'd like to arrange a dialogue where he names the contradictions, we could work through them. We could work through them based upon the original languages. For example, he said, well, this generation will not pass away. I happen to believe that. It's called the destruction of Jerusalem. And there's all sorts of other scholars who have said that for a long time. I just finished going through Matthew chapter 24. You have to recognize the difference between the destruction of Jerusalem and the end days and the final coming of the Messiah. I just would suggest to Sammy, you need to do some more reading on that and not misrepresent that particular text. Mark chapter 14, opsisthe is in the plural, not the singular. You will see. He's talking to the Jewish people, and they did see in the destruction of Jerusalem and will see in the second coming of Christ the testimony of these things. Then we have all these things about contradictions. He talks about William Lane Craig. I take a completely different position than he does on these things. I'm actually responding to them, even though I can only do so very briefly. How many men and angels? Excuse me. If you go online today and read an account of the first responders to the tragedy that took place yesterday with the two female police officers here in London, if you go online and read the details of who the first people to respond was, guess what you'll find out? You'll find differences in how many units arrived and exactly when they arrived. And some people will mention ambulances and some people won't mention ambulances. Does that mean that no one knows what happened yesterday? No, it means that different people had different perspectives and they emphasized different things in their recording of events. And so every one of these can be answered very easily, have been answered. Okay, I'll take that back. Not very easily, but if you give it some thought and recognize that each author has his own intention and his own audience and why he includes certain things, these aren't contradictions. They are exactly what you would expect when you have different people providing you with a historical perspective on what happened in the past. And I would simply point out to you, if you say, oh, well, you shouldn't have to do these things, you have to do it with the Quran. One of the chapters in the book that I have coming out on the Quran, I spend a lot of time, and I had to convince my editors to let me do so because they thought I spent too much time. But I spend a lot of time on parallel accounts in the Quran that tell stories, and they tell them in different words. And in fact, look at the recording of the Quran of the events regarding Lot and what happens at Sodom and Gomorrah. You will have to spend time harmonizing the differences in the wording of what is recorded there. They don't all say the same thing. Are those contradictions? Using Sammy's example, the Quran is filled with contradictions. We shouldn't believe what it has to say. And I could sit here and go through all those contradictions with you and say, so why should I believe Surah 4, 1-7? The debate's over, right? Not for thinking people, it's not. Not for thinking people, it's not. So the Gospels contradict themselves, therefore we shouldn't believe them defense doesn't work because you can't do the same. You have to do the exact same thing with the Quran in harmonizing those particular statements. Keep that in mind. Then we were told forgiveness does not require the atonement. Because there are people, Jesus forgave the man's sin. And people in the Old Testament, they had their sins forgiven. I just want to direct Sammy to the text in the Bible that refers to the answer to that question. Romans chapter 3, verses 24 through 26. And there we are told that Jesus was set forth as a propitiation through faith in his blood so that the righteousness of God might be demonstrated, because in times past he had overlooked sins in light of what? The certainty of the cross of Christ. Anyone whose sins will ever be forgiven from the beginning of time until the last person takes the last breath, the only forgiveness of sins that will be for anyone will come because of the cross of Jesus Christ. The forgiveness to Abraham was due to the fact that God knew that there would be one who would take Abraham's place. That all of God's people would be joined to that one sacrifice, so that by his one atoning death, all of God's people would have forgiveness of sins. And that's why we do see forgiveness in other contexts in light of that, I would direct you again to the tremendous discussion of that, not only Romans chapter 3, but the entirety of the book of Hebrews. Jesus gave himself voluntarily. He says, no man takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord. That's why there can be no meaningful or fair parallel to quote-unquote human sacrifice. The reason that a human sacrificed himself was because it was human life that needed atonement. It was the God-man who gave himself. He had to be God so that he could represent all of God's people and he could live the perfect life. But he had to be truly man so that the life that he gave was a true atonement. The wrath of God and the love of God had to be able to meet in one unique place. And that one unique place required a unique sacrifice. And there was only one God-man and there was only one cross. And that is why the Christian gospel is focused upon that very thing. Thank you very much.
We're now going to move into our third section in this first part, and this is 2 8-minute rebuttals, and after that we'll have a 10-minute break. So we're going to invite Sami to come with this first part of our 8-minute rebuttal.
All right, thank you for that. I'll go again in order. The first point you make is I'm trying to throw your questions out the window by saying they're irrelevant. And I will repeat, they are irrelevant because Surah 4157 and Surah 1458 say that Jesus was not on the cross, Jesus did not die, and he was saved. That's all I really need to know. So asking me how he was saved, who was on the cross, is irrelevant because we know the main points. So you are trying to be picky. Now you say, well, you can't then expect me to throw your Bible out the window. I never said you should throw your Bible out the window. I'm not trying to convert you. But on the same token, don't expect me to believe in your Bible and don't expect me to believe that the supposed evidence for the crucifixion and resurrection is rock solid and hurts my faith. That's what I'm just trying to show. Now, what about the woman saw Jesus on the cross? I'll repeat, the text says they saw them from afar. But what about their testimony? Now this comes all together because there's a straw man in your argument against me. You say I'm trying to use the Bible, then I'm trying to say it's also unreliable. In my opening presentation, I clearly mentioned what methodology I'm using. I said that the post-appearances of Jesus could have been an alive Jesus. However, so the resurrection accounts, the supposed empty tomb incident, that resurrection incident, so the woman's testimony at the tomb, the empty tomb, the angels, my contention is that is not authentic. And the reason why it's not authentic, as I said, they had a misunderstood belief that Jesus rose from the dead. So in order to confirm or to conform that belief with what they now believed, they went back and started making these stories to account for it. Well, if Jesus resurrected, then it must have been like this. And that's why I brought the contradictions about the resurrection accounts. That's why I showed there's an evolution in the story. That's why I even told you Mark's ending says nothing about some post-resurrection appearance and all those testimonies. So there's a lot of added information. That's the argument I'm using. Those resurrection accounts, the empty tomb, the angel who came down, who was at the tomb, I argue that that is not authentic, and all the contradictions are the proof in the pudding. Now you can say, well, all these alleged contradictions can be solved. Yes, they can. But as Bart Ehrman said, the way you solve these contradictions is by simply creating another gospel. So yes, that's how you solve them. If one says 2 people were at the tomb, and another says nobody was at the tomb, and another says 1 person at the tomb, all 3 cannot be right. And I'm sorry, your response that's saying, well, yesterday 2 police officers were tragically killed. And I'm sure you'd get contradictory responses. Yes, you get contradictory responses within the hour, within the day, but the Gospels weren't written the day after Jesus' crucifixion. They were written decades after. So you'd think that after a few decades, they'd have those information in check. For instance, if we look at a historical event that took place 10 years ago, we have those details in check. But obviously, if something happened yesterday, it takes a bit of time to get all the details put together. So that's even a straw man on how your own Bible was collected and written, because that's not what happened. What about the end times? The end times, James White tells me to read up on it. I have read up on it, and I suggest you read up on it and go read the books of E.P. Sanders, one of the most renowned New Testament historical scholars on the historical Jesus, Paula Fredrickson, and even Bart Ehrman, and even Giza Vermes, and the list goes on. These academic books are out there, and if you want a simple book, just go read E.P. Sanders' The Historical Jesus, where he brings up all these verses and more, which talks about how Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet who preached the end of the world, and he was wrong. So I have done my reading. And even if you read the chapter I brought up, Jesus doesn't simply say that only Jerusalem will be destroyed as a sign, and Jerusalem wasn't destroyed anyway. But he doesn't only say that only Jerusalem would be destroyed. He gives a whole list of other things that will happen, including his second coming. Secondly, you ignore the other citation I brought from Mark's Gospel. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus tells the high priest, you will see me coming in the clouds. So it's not only in Matthew. So it's a mistake no matter which way you look at it. And you either say that your gospel is wrong, or you say whoever wrote it misunderstood Jesus, which is my contention that they also misunderstood him when they supposedly thought he resurrected when he was in fact alive. What other arguments did he bring up? Okay, the other point about Allah or God, Islam started Christianity by mistake. No, it didn't. Because how do you connect believing in Jesus' death, and how do you connect that to now saying that this man died for your sin and rose in 3 days? How is there a connection? There is no connection. Simply believing that a man was killed by his enemies and became martyred does not necessitate the next belief that he rose after 3 days and that he died for your sin. You want proof? Bart Ehrman believes in the crucifixion of Jesus, but he doesn't believe in Jesus' resurrection. So it is possible to believe in the crucifixion of Jesus, believing that this man was killed by his enemies, but that doesn't necessitate him rising from the dead and dying for your sin. This is mainly a later Christian theological interpretation. God and nobody else is responsible for that but your own books. And if you don't believe me, again, many people believe in his crucifixion, but they don't believe that he died for your sins. So it would have been perfectly okay for early Jewish Christian believers in Jesus to have believed that their prophet had died as a martyr. But that comes to the next point. The Jewish people and the Jewish Bible, there are no Jews who believe that the Messiah was going to be killed by his enemies. That is a fact. It is only Christians who believe that. Let's be consistent now. You're saying only Muslims believe that. Well, it's only Christians who come 2,000 years later after Moses up to this day and say, well, yeah, it's all over the Bible. So why don't the actual holders of the book believe in that? They never believed in that. And that's why the Quran is even correct when it says that Jesus was saved from his enemies. That proves that the Quranic Messiah does not contradict the criteria. Because if he died, then he can't be the Messiah, because there is no teaching about dying and rising. What about the point about sin being forgiven before the crucifixion? Well, Paul says this. That doesn't matter to me. That's Paul's interpretive account of why sin could be forgiven before Jesus' death. Jesus didn't say that. No Jewish prophet said that. Paul said that because he had this belief that Jesus supposedly died for your sin. Thank you.
All right, let's try to get to those as quickly as possible. The time frame keeps getting smaller and smaller. Sammy pointed out Mark 16, he actually said it ended in verse 13. It actually ends in verse 9. The longer ending of Mark is Mark 16, 9 through 20. That there's no resurrection narrative found there. I would like to point out to you that ignores the fact that, well, first of all, it assumes that Mark is the first gospel being written. That's a theory that many people accept, but there are a lot of people who do not as well. But leaving that aside for a moment, the reality is, why might Mark have stopped his gospel there? Because it was not meant to be a literary work unto itself. It existed within the church. And that means it was a part of the oral preaching. And the prophecy was there in Mark. Jesus had already said in Mark that he was going to die, he was going to rise again. And when you finish at that point, then you have the people who are reading the book giving the testimony that they have experienced, because there are eyewitnesses amongst them, the resurrected Jesus Christ. There might be a very good reason why Mark doesn't go into what Matthew and Luke do at another point in time. It was said that the Christian perspective of the imputation of Christ's righteousness means there is no responsibility for us for our sins. Folks, the Christian gospel is we take full responsibility for our sins and recognize there's nothing we can do about them. There is no way that we can be made right before a holy God. We take responsibility for our sins. That's what repentance is all about, a recognition we are confessing with God we are sinners, and we recognize the only way we can have peace with Him is if He provides that, and He does so in perfection in Jesus Christ. Why would the disciples have been confused? Why would they have been so forlorn during the time period of between the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus had told them? Well, when Jesus first tells them, what's Peter's response? May it never be, Lord. Far be it from you. And what does Jesus have to say to Peter? Get behind me, Satan. You're minding the things of men, not the things of God. If you look at the New Testament as a whole, the reason the disciples are the way they are is because the Spirit hasn't come. And when the Spirit comes, all of a sudden those timid men who are hiding from the Jews are standing on the day of Pentecost proclaiming, standing in front of the Sanhedrin proclaiming, because they're now indwelt by the Spirit of God. In Luke chapter 24, when Jesus meets those two disciples on the road to Emmaus, what does He have to do? He has to open their minds to understand the things spoken about Him, and He spends that time teaching them exactly what the Scriptures say about Him. It is said that, well, the women are standing far away, so that does away with their witness. It says they saw. It doesn't say they guessed. It doesn't say they didn't know. There's nothing in either of the recorded Gospels that mention that indicates that there's anything untrue about their witness, uncertain about their witness. It's just giving us the accurate reality that most Jews are going to stay away from the Romans while they're killing Jews. That is in no way, shape, or form an indication that therefore their testimony is not weighty and should not be accepted, because both the Gospels record that testimony without a word of amelioration. Bart Ehrman says the only way you can harmonize these things is by creating another gospel. Yes, that is exactly what he says. And he's wrong. And I can prove that he's wrong. He doesn't allow for harmonization. He doesn't allow for us, he doesn't even try to interact with the best that Christian scholarship has produced in allowing Matthew to be Matthew and allowing Luke to be Luke and allowing Mark to be Mark, and yet recognizing they're telling the same story. And I can give you examples. I've listened to his classes. Like I said, I've debated the man. I've listened to his own lectures where he mockingly talks about how people harmonize things, never dealing with the scholarly harmonization that is there. He just simply dismisses it, as he would dismiss your attempts to harmonize the various versions of various stories in the Quran as well. The next one. It was very interesting. Sammy said, well, okay, but he talked about what happened in London here. But these Gospels are written decades later. You'd think they'd get their story straight by then. Let me tell you something. If they said it in the exact same words, what would Sammy be saying about them? That there was collusion involved. That they got together and got their stories together. So the fact that they give different elements of the oral preaching from a primitive period only proves what? That the Gospels are exactly what we've always said they are. We don't have to approach them in a naturalistic way and make them contradictory to one another. He says that's just a straw man. No, that was not a straw man. That's recognizing that attacking the Gospels unfairly and not allowing them to harmonize their statements without turning them into just one gospel, That's what Christians have been doing for a long time. Then we heard about E.P. Sanders. And look, folks, I don't know what E.P. Sanders said about Guinea. I'm not sure that Sami does either, because that was the context of his comments. But E.P. Sanders is a great scholar, but he's very infected by naturalistic materialism. And I would just ask the Muslims here, if I stood up and say, I've done my homework, go read the Holland book on the fact that Muhammad doesn't exist. I mean, it was on BBC. That makes it true, doesn't it? I mean, have you seen that book? It's yay thick. There's lots of footnotes in there. And yet you and I both know there's really actually nothing new in there. And you as a Muslim would go, yeah, but his worldview influences all the choices of the... Yeah, same thing with E.P. Sanders. And that's why I keep looking for the first consistent Muslim apologist who will be able to recognize the liberals on the Christian side and going, you know, I shouldn't be quoting those guys. Because if I apply their worldview to my stuff, it's going to refute my position. So I need to be looking for the people where I can be consistent in my argumentation. That would be a very, very good thing. It was said that I ignored Mark chapter 14. I did. I may have been talking too fast. Sometimes we don't hear things. I mentioned the exact Greek term there, opsis then. I mentioned that it's plural in Mark chapter 14. He says, he was saying that high priest. He was talking to the people. It's a plural word in the original language in Greek. And I was saying the application of that was that the Jews would see that. They'd see that in the destruction that was going to come upon them, which Jesus talked about as he was going to the cross, by the way, as well as in his second coming in the spiritual sense as well. I did not ignore it. And then we had finally Bart Ehrman, where he says, well, Bart Ehrman believes Jesus is crucified. Yes, he does. But doesn't believe he rose from the dead. Why not? Why doesn't he? Because he's a naturalistic materialist. That's why. And you see, the historical record can only get you so far. And for a naturalistic materialist, Bart comes up with all sorts of possible, well, maybe it happened this way or maybe it happened that way. And again, do you think Bart Ehrman believes that the moon was split in half for Muhammad? Or that Muhammad rode a little winged creature to Jerusalem and then went up to the 7 levels of heaven? Well, there's historical evidence, it's right there, but Bart Ehrman doesn't believe it. Why not? Because he's a naturalistic materialist. And so you see, the point is, we have to stand back and go, all right, what evidence do we have? Does all the evidence say that Jesus Christ died upon a cross? Yes. Every bit of historical evidence from the first 100 years says it. There's prophetic evidence from Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53. What says otherwise? 40 Arabic words from 600 years later from someone who had never even read either the Old Testament or the New Testament. That's all you've got. That's what the debate's about this evening. Keep your eye on the ball. I think it's important. Thanks a lot.
Well, this concludes our first section of the debate. What you're about to witness now is called Crossfire, and each of our speakers are going to be given 90 seconds, and it's going to alternate back and forth in 90-second segments. There'll be 14 of those that'll last about 21 minutes, or exactly 21 minutes. And I think it'll be a good interchange. We're going to begin with Sami. He's going to start in just a moment with the first of our Crossfire.
All right, I'd first like to turn to the scholarship, because I've brought up mainstream scholars, E.P. Sanders, Paula Fredrickson, even Bart Ehrman. These are respected mainstream scholars. Now, I appreciate the fact that you disagree with them, but if they remain accepted and respected academic mainstream scholarships, and they teach about Jesus teaching the apocalyptic prophecies. But don't you think it's a bit unfair to compare mainstream scholars to any fringe scholar out there? I'm aware that there are people who teach that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, didn't exist, but there are people who teach several things, and one of those supposed scholars who teaches about the Prophet Muhammad not existing and published the book is Robert Spencer, and he's not an Islamic scholar by any means. On the other hand, people like E.P. Sanders, Bart Ehrman, they have done their studies, they know the Greek, they know the Hebrew, they know the language. In many cases, some of them were Christians. So don't you think it's a bit unfair to just throw all their scholarship out? And at the same time, I don't rely on these people to affirm my faith. Whether they affirm my faith or not has no bearing whatsoever on the arguments that I'm making. In fact, I don't accept them to affirm my faith for the arguments.
Well, the irony here is that Sanders, Ehrman, and all these others substantiate my position in the debate tonight. They all believe that Jesus was crucified. They all recognize that the historical information is without question that it was Jesus, not someone who was made to look like Jesus. It was Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified on a Roman cross outside of Jerusalem during the days of Herod and under the orders of Pilate. So if Ehrman can say that one of the clearest facts of history is that Jesus died, then what we're dealing with here are the interpretations they then make of what that meant. So we can't change the focus of the debate to the resurrection, because the reason that someone like Bart Ehrman, by the way, Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet, but that's not all he was. You see, the problem is they want to limit Jesus to something much smaller than he actually was. Jesus was a first century Jew. He lived in that context. That's what he taught. That's how he should be understood. There's no question about that. There are insights you can gain from all of that. But the fact is, you then have a limitation of the application that those folks will allow. But the fact is, for the debate this evening, they're on my side. They agree with me. And you say, well, it has no bearing on your faith. Well, again, the question, Sami, is the Islamic faith a faith that has historical grounding, or is it something that has no historical grounding whatsoever and ignores the mountain of historical evidence?
All right, I've actually addressed that, and I raised that point first in my presentation. They affirm your point that he was on the cross, but again, all these historical references do nothing to contradict my point, because the Quran says a crucifixion did take place and people thought it was Jesus. So that affirms my point, and I actually raised that first. But secondly, as we all know, your faith doesn't revolve around the cross only. Your faith also revolves around the resurrection. And as Paul said, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then your faith is null and void. And they all reject the resurrection of Jesus. Now you say it's because they reject the supernatural, but that's a bit unfair on them, because they've given evidences as to why those stories are doubtful, just as I have given my evidence as to why those resurrection accounts are doubtful as well. So they reject the resurrection. And if you can prove that the resurrection wasn't taking place, then it also affirms my point, which I made in my presentation, that these resurrection accounts were made up later to account for their misunderstood belief that an alive Jesus was a resurrected Jesus, and that's why you find all the contradictions in the stories, and that's why you find these academics rejecting it, because of all that evidence.
A meeting of a live Jesus, as we have pointed out, would require that Jesus correct their misapprehensions, or Jesus is the worst teacher who has ever lived. Can you imagine Jesus allowing his disciples to begin an entire religion based on a falsehood because he just didn't take the time to tell them, guys, I wasn't crucified? I'm sorry, that is utterly untenable from any logical, rational, historical perspective, and there's not one person that's been quoted this evening who thinks that's what happened. That's not what Sanders says. That's not what Ehrman says. That's not what any of these scholars think happened. But the interesting thing is, these very same scholars that you are quoting against the resurrection, which isn't the debate this evening, but quoting against the resurrection, they would also reject everything you believe about Jesus' life. I mean, Bart Ehrman would not believe that Jesus formed little birds of clay and breathed on them and they blew away. And he would say to you, that's a story that came from the Gnostic Gospels, because it did. And Bart Ehrman and E.P. Sanders would not believe that Jesus spoke from his cradle, because that's another story that came from early Christians, but hundreds of years after the event, and they would point that out too. And so my question is, where is the consistency in relying upon these individuals when they would say the evidence would clearly refute the Quran as well? Where is the consistency at this particular point in time? That's what we need to be looking at. And again, I simply point out that these scholars are on my side in regards to the thesis of the debate this evening, and that is the Quran's denial of the historical reality of the crucifixion itself.
All right, that's technically false. I'll repeat it again, because the Quran does not deny the historical event. It says it was made to appear to them, so I'd expect them to say that. But secondly, that's another straw man argument, because I even said, I'm not relying on these scholars to affirm my faith. Whether they affirm my faith or not has no bearing on the other arguments that have been raised. And the arguments that they've done with their scholarship has been backed by evidence. And then you say, well, Jesus would have been a terrible teacher if he just let them misunderstand him. Well, he actually did. The apocalyptic teachings are false, yet disciples were teaching that. So he was a bad teacher because they were teaching something that is false. The verses clearly say that those things were going to happen in his generation. They never happened in his generation. Mainstream scholarship says he's an apocalyptic prophet. Now, you can refuse to accept the mainstream scholarship. You can refuse to accept the clear text. But that's the evidence right there, and that's the point I'm making. The fact that they misunderstood him on these apocalyptic teachings shows it's also plausible that they misunderstood a alive Jesus for a resurrected Jesus. That's the whole point I'm making. So I'm staying very consistent to my argument. So he did teach them a false teaching.
First of all, we need to define crucifixion versus the crucifixion of Jesus. You say, well, a crucifixion did take place. Of whom? Oh, you're being picky. That's what we've been told this evening. We can't ask those questions, but we have to accept the assertion. If you're going to make the assertion, then you have to be able to back up the assertion itself. And so, when you say, well, crucifixion took place, of whom? What happened to Jesus? Was he taken up to heaven? Oh, but you're being picky. Those are irrelevant. No, those are all very relevant. I think we all see that. If you can't answer those questions this evening, I don't think you can begin to substantiate the thesis of the debate in any way, shape, or form. You say, these things have no bearing on my faith. What if I said to you, well, what Bart Ehrman says has no bearing on my faith because the resurrection happened whether Bart Ehrman believes it or not? Now what I've said is the resurrection itself is an ahistorical event for which I'm not going to offer any evidence. I'm not going to do that, but my question is that what Islam is? Is Islam a faith that has no historical foundation? Did the night flight take place? Did it take place in time and space? Was the moon split in two? Did the Hijra take place? Was there a cave? Did Jibreel speak to Muhammad? Did the Quran come down on Laylat al-Qadr? Is this all mythology? Is this just a faith that has no connection with history? And if so, doesn't that mean that Islam bases itself completely differently than the Torah and the Injil which came before it?
All right, let's answer your questions. Who was on the cross? Not Jesus. Was he taken to heaven? Yes. Question is answered. That's the main point. So those are the main points that are being made. So everything else is being picky. Now, is everything... And now I'll ask you a question. Who was at the tomb? Was it two angels? Was it one? Was anyone there? Because each are contradicting each other. Who went to the tomb? Was it three women? Was it two? Or was it one? And where did the disciples meet Jesus? In Galilee or Jerusalem? So please respond to those points. Now, what about the points you say, well, is everything in the Quran just on faith and can things be backed historically? Yes, many claims can be backed historically, but some claims, not every claim can be backed historically, and that's not a problem for a theist. Many claims in the Bible can be backed historically as well. And anyway, tonight's debate is not about whether the Prophet went to Jerusalem, which was reported by mass narrations, which passes the historical test, by the way, but we can debate that on another day, which comes down to proving the prophethood of Muhammad, peace be upon him. So that's not the debate for tonight, but I'd like you to answer those questions concerning the contradictory accounts of the resurrection. 2, 3, who was at the tomb, and so forth. Thank you.
So now we've been told, yes, Jesus was taken to heaven. Okay, so Surah 158 is saying Jesus was taken to heaven. So that means that the disciples didn't meet the living Jesus. Or was he taken to heaven after meeting with the disciples? But the only reason you know that he met with the disciples is because the Gospels say so, but you can't say you trust the Gospels because they're contradictory. How does all that work? Surah 4, 158 doesn't tell us that. And in fact, the vast majority of the Muslims believe that Jesus was taken to heaven at that point in time. Again, this is not being picky. If you're making a historical assertion that contradicts the written documents that came from the first century, you have to deal with these things. Now,
Again, how many angels were there? If one person reports that they spoke with an angel, and the other person says, well, there were two of them, Sami thinks that's contradictory. Why is that contradictory? If one of them said there was only one angel and no others, and the other one says there were two angels, not one, that would be contradictory. But if one focuses upon one thing, for example, in the Gadarene demoniac story, in one version of it, the focus is solely upon the one Gadarene demoniac. In another, there is the brief mention that there was a second man with him who never says or does anything. So one writer decides to focus upon the one gives the added information. Added information all of a sudden becomes contradiction. It's not contradiction, and again, you could never harmonize the parallel accounts in the Quran if you engage in this kind of rejection of meaningful harmonization. You just couldn't do it.
And if we can do it, then we're both wrong. So that's the tu quoque fallacy and doesn't hurt and doesn't help your cause. Now you say one account is giving more details than the other. No, that's wrong, because one account clearly says there was only one angel. Another account says there were two. So these are two different stories. You're just deciding to make your own story up to say, oh, well, that guy decided to leave that information out, and that guy decided to put that information in. You didn't address the part about where did they meet him, in Jerusalem or Galilee, because it clearly says in Luke and Acts they met him at this town. In Matthew it says they met him in that town first, Jerusalem or Galilee. There's no such thing as leaving that information out when you say the first place we met him in was in Jerusalem and the other account says Galilee. Secondly, in my presentations, I gave your Gospels the benefit of the doubt. They're not my only case. Before I gave your Gospels the benefit of the doubt, I clearly mentioned that these Gospels aren't written by the disciples. I don't believe they're written by the disciples. I don't even believe they were transmitted by the disciples. I don't even believe you have any writings from the disciples. So I made that point clear. So I don't even believe you have any actual first-hand accounts from Jesus' followers who supposedly preached his resurrection and so forth. But I gave your Gospels the benefit of the doubt.
Well, notice what we just had here. We were told that one of the Gospels says that only one angel was there. I'd like the reference, and I'd like to know where the Greek monos appears there. So if you could show us where the Greek term monos appears, that's the term only, then we can deal with that. But notice what was just said here. These books were not written by disciples. So where are the original disciples of Jesus? We have a situation here where, again, we're talking about the crucifixion of Jesus. Basically, Sami has said, yeah, history's on your side. But that doesn't really matter because the Quran says otherwise. But the Quran does tell us historically true things, but on this instance, we can't historically examine it. And yet, here's a man who believes that in Surah 5, we have recorded for us the actual statements of the disciples to Jesus requesting that a table be sent down from heaven. That's why Surah 5 is called Surah Al-Ma'idah, the table. The story that's given. So you have someone who will accept something that the disciples said that's recorded 600 years later, no evidence of it for 600 years going back to the days of the disciples. That's okay because the Quran says it. But the actual Gospels that come from the first century, we can't trust what they said because one gives more information than another gives. Is that consistent? Is that a sound basis upon which to substantiate the thesis of the debate tonight? That's really the question we have to be thinking about.
All right, I'll ask for the third time. Did they meet him in Galilee first or in Jerusalem? And history is not on your side because they only affirm the crucifixion, but as Paul said, your faith does not rely around the crucifixion only. And if it can be proven that the resurrection accounts are baseless, then that helps my cause, because if there is no resurrection, there is no death. Now, again, the Gospels are saying two different things on the accounts. Can you explain who went to the tomb first? Was it 3 women? Was it 2 women? Or was it 1? Those are saying 3 different stories. And if you don't think it's a problem that the ending of Mark has been added into with that whole account of the supposed post-appearances, then What would be a problem for your gospel? If an entire paragraph had been added to put in a supposed story of what happened after Jesus rose, if that's not a problem, if someone's adding verses into your text about a supposed story, then what do you consider a problem if someone can tamper with the text and they can just make up whatever they feel like? What would you consider to be a consistent argument if that's not a consistent argument to doubt the authenticity of your gospel?
I know that you want to get away from the actual thesis subject tonight because it's already been established, to be honest with you. Now we want to go on and talk about alleged contradictions. We want to talk about, and the idea is, well, the resurrection is connected to the crucifixion, and so therefore you need to deal with all these contradictions allegedly regarding the crucifixion. I guess I'll just take that as an establishment that we've established the crucifixion took place. All the evidence says it was Jesus, not just a crucifixion. I reject the idea that, well, yes, a crucifixion took place, but it wasn't Jesus. There's no evidence of some other crucifixion that these people are talking about. But I've written an entire book on the subject of textual criticism. I'm not sure if you've had an opportunity to read my discussion, Mark 16, 9 through 20, all the textual evidence related to that. You say, what would be a problem? The problem would be if we couldn't recognize that Mark 16, 9 through 20 was an addition. And that's the problem you have with the Quran. You're listening? Because that's what we were talking about on Monday night. You see, we, because of the manuscript tradition we have, can recognize the later additions to the text because we have the earlier texts. But what do you have for the Quran prior to the Uthmanic revision? What did Uthman do with the materials that were not a part of his official version? Why did he disagree with Abdullah ibn Masud on his readings and demand that he turn over his exemplar? Those are the issues that we can't get into tonight, but they are issues that are very, very relevant.
All right, I'd like to establish a point because you're doing something very smart, which supposedly undermines me. The main thesis of the crucifixion, I'm the one who established the thesis on both the crucifixion and the resurrection. And I'm the one who originally said that there are a lot of historical sources that affirm the crucifixion, which backs my argument. So let's get that out of the way. I'm the first one who raised it. So when you keep repeating it and they giggle, that's affirming my points. Secondly, why did I link the crucifixion to the resurrection? Because if you can clearly prove that someone rose from the dead, then the Quran is proven false because it says he was alive. But if you can prove that the resurrection accounts are false, full of contradictions and unreliable, and that no death ever happened, then that affirms the Quranic point that nobody died. So there's a connection. If you can't follow along, that's not my problem. Now, what about the manuscripts? The manuscripts help you know the false from the right. Wrong, because the manuscripts you have aren't even the original manuscripts. They're the copy of 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 a worse copy manuscript. As many mainstream scholars have even said, you can't even go to the original Bible. What you have is a copy, not even of the original. So you know false stories from the copy, not even from the original.
If you're going to quote Bart Ehrman, then you're going to have to defend Bart Ehrman. And Bart Ehrman is simply wrong. We have a number of papyri that could not be a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. It's simply impossible. He is being, shall we say, somewhat obtuse at that point, and you're wrong. Have you ever examined P52, P75, P66? These are not copies of copies of copies of copies of copies 10 generations down the road. So the facts just simply don't substantiate that at that point. And if they were, why are they so much alike to one another? But here's the problem. Here's what we're dealing with this evening. What Sami has told us is, yeah, the Quran says that God made it appear this way. We can't tell you how. We can't tell you what he did. But it made it appear this way, so history is going to tell you there was a crucifixion, and so all the historical evidence backs my argument. No, it doesn't. Because the historical evidence was that a specific person was crucified. And that specific person, even according to Sami's own assertions, then met with his disciples after that event. And we are actually being asked, there's always in whatever, whether it's the Ahmadi view or whatever it is, there's always in whatever Islamic position is taken a fatal flaw. Here's the fatal flaw. What we're having to believe this evening, we're being told we must believe this evening, is that Jesus failed to correct the misapprehension of his disciples, and the result was they all went out preaching that he had died and rose again. Can you imagine that taking place? Can you imagine that happening? I cannot. That's it. I knew we'd lose track of where we were.
Well, that finishes our crossfire section. We're now going to move into our final arguments. So we're going to ask Sami to begin those. And Sami will have 5 minutes and be followed immediately by James. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Just before I get into conclusions, can I tell you what happened? I did tell you what happened. Jesus wasn't crucified, he was saved. Now, in order for me to completely prove all of that, I need a 2-hour debate to prove the divinity of Islam. And then that is the affirmation. But there are many things in your own Bible which you can't prove. You see, I'm honest enough to prove that not everything in my book or my beliefs are always going to be proven through the historical method. The second you are a believer in God already affirms that point. So not everything has to be proven by historical record A, historical record B. I'm not shy to say that, but many Christians have compromised on that to appease secular atheists and to make the arguments a bit easier on themselves. Secondly, the historical references that you bring up still affirm my point. The Quran says Jesus, it was made to appear like Jesus. They thought it was Jesus. So when you tell me people are writing about Jesus on the cross, I tell you that's what the Quran says they thought. And as I said in my presentation, I said if you can bring me a huge amount of people who didn't believe that Jesus was on the cross, that proves the Quran wrong. So when you're trying to be a bit humorous on that, I already addressed that in my first point. Secondly, back to the resurrection account, because this is very interesting, because we actually have a first century source. Some date it as early as the time of Paul. It's called the Didache. Now this ancient source says nothing about a resurrection. And this source is dated to the same time as Paul. And it was accepted by early Christians. And before you want to argue, it's not a Gnostic text. It wasn't a Gnostic text. So that's a first century report that casts major doubt on your supposed resurrection. In fact, the Eucharist, I'm sure you all know about the Eucharist. In the Didache, the Eucharist says nothing about Jesus dying for your sin. In fact, here's something even more interesting. In the Eucharist account in the Gospel of Luke, we have a variant manuscript that talks about the Eucharist, which also says nothing about Jesus dying for your sin, that this blood is for the new covenant. Now this again casts major doubt on your supposed resurrection accounts, which simply go back to my first contention, that all of these resurrection accounts are doubtful, contradictory, and I'll say bluntly, they're made up. And how do we know they're made up? All these contradictions prove it. And what further evidence do you need? We have first century documents that prove it, and we even have a variant manuscript of Luke that proves it as well. And why is that important to my case? Because if I can show that no resurrection took place, then it means that Jesus never rose from the dead. And if Jesus never rose from the dead, it means he never died, and the Quran is right to say he never died. Follow along. So I'm being very consistent. And he still didn't address the point. Did they see him in Galilee first or Jerusalem? Please answer that point. And another inconsistency I'd like to point out. You tried to mock Islam, and you all giggled when he said, the Quran says that the Jews said we killed the Messiah. Yet you never addressed the points where your own Bible says the Jews killed the Messiah. Where the Jews killed him. You didn't address your own Gospels where it says they called him the King of the Jews. So if you're going to giggle at your own text for consistency. And then the other point he makes, well, how could Jesus never tell his disciples he was alive? How could he let them go on with this false belief? I've already proved he did with the apocalyptic teachings. He let them go and he let them teach these false apocalyptic teachings, which mainstream scholars like Bart Ehrman, E.P. Sanders, Paolo Fredrickson, Giza Vermes, and the list goes on. And if you want to compare these scholars to Robert Spencer, who can't even read Arabic. 2-year-old children can read better Arabic than him. To even think that this man is comparison to these men is a joke. At least these men, they read the Bible, they read the Hebrew, they read the Greek. So it's an insult to compare those two. At the end of the day, Islam is clear. It says that Jesus was saved. That's how he truly conquered death. And that's why it's Good Friday, because the Messiah was saved and he will come back. Thank you.
All right, well, I would like to thank all of you for coming this evening for this very spirited debate. And as it has become a tradition of mine, I especially want to thank Sami for being here this evening. I think this has been a very valuable debate. I've been wanting to do this subject, and like I said, every time I engage this, I've ended up debating with a Muslim who didn't actually believe in the normative Muslim perspective, so I appreciate that. I did bring, I think, a very important one that I would recommend to everybody, a book called Reinventing Jesus, How Contemporary Skeptics Miss the Real Jesus and Mislead Popular Culture. A lot about Bart Ehrman and those guys in here from good scholars, including Dan Wallace. I'd like to give that to Sami for your library. Now, Sami said not everything needs to be proven historically. I firmly agree with that. I firmly agree with that. That's why I reject Bart Ehrman's rejection of the resurrection, because he thinks it does. And that's the whole problem. I'm not saying we all need to become materialists in any way, shape, or form. But you see, God is the God of history, and he acts in time. And the events of Jesus' life took place. That's one of the major differences between the Jesus of the Bible and Jesus of the Quran. There's only one time in the Quran that Jesus speaks in a historically verifiable place, and that's from his cradle. Other than that, he's just a disembodied voice just floating around. In the New Testament, you see God acting in time. In the days of this, when this person was governor, at this place, this took place. The point is, unlike all the pagan religions, God acted in time. In the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son. And so that's why it is important, because this is a historical teaching, this is a historical element that the Quran comes along and without even trying to provide an argument, without even understanding the message of the New Testament, denies. And that's why all the questions that haven't been answered, other than saying, well, that's just the way it is, are so very important for us this evening. By the way, I've never heard the Didache place in the days of Paul. It's at earliest late 1st century, and it's nothing but a manual. It is not a summary of the gospel. It is a disciplinary manual. The idea that somehow, throws major doubt on the resurrection. I've never met any historian that's ever read the Didache that way. Never. I've read the Didache. I've taught on the Didache. I taught the development of patristic theology. We translated the Didache. The idea that somehow casts major doubt or a textual variant that, again, we've lectured on these things. This somehow casts major doubt. No, Sami, it doesn't. Not if you would apply the same standards to your examination of the New Testament that you do to the Quran. It would cast no doubt at all. It also would help you to understand that there was 40 days, which you reject. But there was 40 days in which Jesus ministered to his disciples, and it took place in 2 different places. And Matthew and Luke give us different narratives of when those meetings took place. Take the time, stop reading Bart Ehrman, and go find someone who has the same level of faith in the text of the Bible you have in the Quran. You don't have to accept what he says, but wouldn't it be refreshing to actually read what someone says who believes their faith? And is a supernaturalist, a theist? And see if they cannot harmonize these events for you. That might be a really good thing to do. By the way, the only person this evening who mentioned Robert Spencer was Sami Zaatari. I never mentioned him. Did you think I mentioned him? I was talking about the Holland book. Spencer's book is about yay thick, not that thick. I was talking about the Channel 4 BBC thing. What was it called? Origins of Islam or whatever it was. That's what I was talking about. I never even mentioned Spencer. And I never connected anyone to him. So, what do we have this evening? Basically, what has been said was, well, if Surah 4:1-7 is true, then history would say that someone was crucified. But history doesn't say someone was crucified. History says Jesus of Nazareth was crucified.
And all of his disciples say he was crucified. And they all say that they encountered him and that he had the wound prints in his hands and his side. And he taught them about the resurrection. And he taught them about the prophecies that were fulfilled in him. You have to say they were all liars. They were all deceived in their minds. They were crazy. There's no other way to explain it. Because if Sammy's thesis is true, then Jesus met with the disciples, but he either didn't tell them, well, because they got those apocalyptic teachings wrong. Matthew 24 is not a parallel, even though we've shown you that you're misinterpreting it, is not a parallel to Jesus failing to tell his disciples that he wasn't crucified. So where are those disciples that Jesus did tell? They left no record.
The reality is completely different, friends. The Bible's clear. History is clear. Jesus died and rose again. Thank you very much.
Well, you've all clapped, but let's give a hand to both Sammy and to James. It's been a wonderful year. Just to let you know that an audio version of the debate will be available at TrinityRoadChapel.org, TrinityRoadChapel.org fairly shortly, if all things have worked out well up there. I think they probably have. There's also a video that's been recorded, and we're going to hand that over to James and Alpha and Omega Ministries, and they'll be making that available at their discretion when all that's made available. I want to thank you for coming, for being an interested participant in the debate by being here, and also our thanks are out to all those. I think there was well over 300 people who listened in on the debate through the live stream, and we're very grateful for those that have taken the time out and the interest in this debate to be able to spend it here with us. So thank you and good night.